Is it not working?
It's working.
Okay, I'm just gonna leave my phone here somewhere.
There we go. Hello? Okay, cool. All right. Is it yours recording?
Yeah, it's live. Okay. We're live. Okay. So you know what I was thinking about was when Solomon said that flow and flux is different. It reminded me of last time when we were talking about revolution and evolution, and how we were talking about like how change happens on a timeline. So, I mean, I guess the question is, what is change, right? If you say flux is change, but flow is not change, what do you mean?
Oh, me.
Yeah.
You're the one that brought up the distinction, right?
Yeah, I guess for me, it's almost like flow is kind of maybe a general state. So when you think about the flow of a river, right, the Heraclitus quote, you're thinking about the whole body of water, the total body of water.
Yeah.
But when you think about flux, it feels more particular, right? So maybe there's even with the person, the same person that goes into the river isn't the same person that comes out, whatever, right? Something like that.
Well, is flux a general? Oh, okay, I see.
You see what I'm saying? So
yeah,
it's a local. We should maybe say localized. Flux maybe seems localized, whereas flow isn't localized. So in the case of someone walking into a body of water, the flux, it's that instance of that person walking into the water.
Mm-hmm.
It's not the total river that's changing. It's just that one place.
Well, wouldn't flux be more the universal of it? Like you have, you'd have like you're saying the flow of the river would be like the movement of the river, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then the flux of the river would be the movement of the river and the person stepping into the river and then stepping out and stepping in again, and the river changing as it does. You know, the water evaporates and new rain comes down, and so the flux is the more universal thing, where the flow is just the very specific movement of it.
Why would you say universal? Why are you saying universal?
Because it's the consistently changing aspect of it rather than the very specific movement of it.
Yeah. I guess I'm still thinking of it as flux being more particular. And maybe that would make it more universal, right? Because if the flux is the particular, like the particles changing, each of the particles are going to be in flux, but the river itself, right, isn't. But yeah, so and universal meaning just applied to more things than just one.
Yeah, applied to a more step back view of it. So you're seeing all of the different changes. So there is the movement, which is the flow, but then there's all of the other aspects of change that come into it, including time. As time progresses, then that's another type of change that's happening, right?
But then it wouldn't be the particular flux of the river. It would be the flux of just flux itself.
Yeah. It's just like, so you have the river, which is a part of this continual flux. So that is a part of that flux, the perpetual flux. Because it's that translation difference, right? That's what we started it, was the translation difference of Pantarei into either everything flows or everything is in perpetual flux. So it is talking about everything at that point, right? So everything is moving would definitely be a statement, but everything is continually changing in every aspect of its being.
Yeah.
Would be the perpetual flux.
Yeah, I mean, but now it doesn't seem like there is a necessary distinction, because movement itself is change. Until you begin to distinguish specific types of movements.
Yeah. So then, that's what I was saying is, I mean, I think you were saying it too, is that they're defining two different types of movement. Flux, and that's what I was saying, flux is the universal, and then
The flow.
the flow would be the specific type
Yeah.
of movement at that time.
It's weird though. I mean, it's probably also weird why. I guess I won't say that, but if we think of like particle physics,
Mm-hmm.
right? There's a weird, and it could go to revolution evolution connection, but you have like the particular,
Mm-hmm.
you have the localized,
Mm-hmm.
which would be we have flux, we have flow, but then on a universal scale we also have flux. And so like the further you move in either direction from the localized event, the more universal you get. But one of them is a micro and one of them being a macro.
Yeah. Okay. And so the macro and the micro are both universals, but
Mhm.
they're on different ends of the spectrum.
Yeah.
Do you think that means that they're necessarily intertwined?
What do you mean, like in the way that they operate and the way that they work, but at different magnitudes?
Or maybe even what they are?
Well, what do we mean by macro and micro? Like, how do we define that? Like, are we saying it in different scales, like size, or?
Well, you were saying as what the
Yeah.
particular, like the
Mhm.
particle level, and then the universal
Universal.
level. Yeah.
So
Right.
there is a sense of magnitude there, for sure. But,
Mhm.
I mean, that's implied by micro, macro.
Mm-hmm.
But micro and macro of what? And so it is about magnitude, but in what aspect are we talking about? It's macro and micro.
I mean, the full term, right, is microcosm, macrocosm.
Okay.
So, like, thinking about the cosmos, or just life itself. So,
Mhm.
life on a micro scale reflects, or is similar to, and what Chris is putting forward is the question: Are they more intertwined, right?
Right.
Like the cosmos we see itself.
Mm-hmm. Doesn't the macro level imply that it's universal, and the micro level imply that it's particular?
Yeah. Yeah. That's.
That's what we're saying here.
Yeah. Yeah. I think so.
And how? So we're now talking about the flux here, but how is that really different than the flow? So we've said one thing definitive about the flux, right? That it's in perpetuity, that it has a timeline attached to it, right? That's attached to a timeline.
Mhm.
It's perpetual. It's always going to happen.
I think the way we're distinguishing it is that the flow would be more of a cosmos, right? So again, a localized event, a river.
Didn't you say the localized event about the flux too? No.
Mm-mm.
Particular.
Okay.
Yeah, particular and universal. Right?
Yeah. Particular, universal, and then local being
Mhm.
somewhere in the middle of that.
Where they're meeting, where those things are meeting.
Yeah.
But yeah, I forgot.
So how you were saying how do we distinguish those two, the flow from the flux?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's what I mean. Like that's why it does seem more universal, because in between where those two things are meeting, the local event that has a timeline, that has all these other things. It has strict guidelines, maybe something like that.
Mm-hmm.
But when you break it apart in either direction, it doesn't have. You're not looking at any one thing. You're no longer looking at the river, right? When you go to the
Mhm.
microcosm, you're looking at the individual particles and the molecules, whatever. But then when you go to the macro, you're looking at maybe the region or the biosphere, or even the planet Earth,
Yeah.
and beyond that. And so it seems like flux is actually definitely more universal, but more all-encompassing, right? It does seem to fit with an idea of everything flows, everything is in flux, because it's including all three instances we have.
Mm-hmm.
The flux of the particular, the flux of the localized, which is dependent upon the flux of the macro, right? As the Earth cycles change, those rivers are going to change. They are maybe constantly flowing themselves, but it as a thing is always in flux. The tides will ebb, whatever, banks will rise and fall.
Mm-hmm.
So it doesn't, in this case, I think it looks like flux is maybe a more accurate representation of a universality of kind of change, where flow is less universal because you have to attach it to, I guess, like a particular motion, right?
Mm-hmm.
Flux is any motion, any change.
So do you think when it comes to something like time, that is specific to the flow and not to the flux, being that the flux is either a universal or a particular, then when it comes to something like the time, where that's something that is tied to our perception, does that have to be based on the individual motion, the localized motion, that flow?
Yeah, I don't know because necessarily, like, you have to raise the question of objectivity when you're saying that. What is the relation of the observer, right, to the object being? Because I mean, we can even say the river is obviously in flux, but when you as the observer is right next to the river, you're not really observing the change of the river itself.
Mm-hmm.
You're again observing maybe
Part of it.
Part of it. And so, but once you zoom out in time, but you can't zoom out physically in time, but we can zoom out our perspective to try to bring a wider lens of time or something like that, or a wider perspective into view.
Mm-hmm.
But that, yeah, it seems.
I mean, I guess the question is, like, doesn't everything depend on our perspective? Even if you can, I mean, obviously, if you consider the relation of an object to the subject, it's always in relation to the subject. How could it not be ever in relation to the subject?
Sure, always.
Right.
Today's podcast has been brought to you by the ego. But it changes, right? Like where your perspective is changes your understanding of what you're viewing. Like you have to, if you want a more comprehensive view, you have to change your perspective.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Well, so what do you, and by changing perspective, is that what you were talking about with like the zooming in or zooming out of any given like perception of time?
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, and because that, like, it almost seems like the localized event, the flow, in having such a dichotomy, right, where we're basically saying that you can use flow and flux to represent the same thing, the same definition, but it's more about the objects it's representing. And so the localized event, the flow, is like a boundary. It allows us to distinguish things now. This river. But as soon as you zoom out or zoom in, you can no longer say this river. And so you can no longer give your... I mean, I guess you could still say this river, obviously, but...
But really you'd be saying this section of a river, or this river enclosed by this landmass.
Yeah, or this molecule in this river.
Mm-hmm.
And so it allows a place of relatability, relationship, which you couldn't, without that localized event, without that flow, you couldn't actually begin to observe a flux, either micro or macro. And so that, like, with the whole time aspect... yeah, I don't know. It seems that by setting a boundary right now where you are excluding certain things in your perspective gives you the opportunity to then be inclusive in your boundary or your perspective. By, like, distinguishing a localized event, you can then begin to distinguish the things leading up to that event, the microcosm, and then you could then also maybe predict possible outcomes of that event. But without it, you have no relatability.
Okay.
And so flow, I mean, I'm still trying to work on this idea of flow and flux, right?
Yeah.
Being different,
Yeah.
not being the same thing. And so what is it that the flow gives you? I mean, even when you were working on your translation, did you see that regular translation?
Always
all things flow,
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, well then what do I do with flow?
Mm-hmm.
What are the implications of flow?
Mm-hmm. Well, that was the thing, was the implications of those. And I mean, especially when it comes to something like time, that's where it's confusing to me, because time, as far as I understand it, seems to be always, like you were saying, always in relation to something. So it's movement, but it's movement in relation to something.
Yeah.
So when it comes to something being localized or something being I don't know, particular or universal, then it seems like the relation is the opposing thing. So with flow, the relation that can either be to the macro or the micro.
Mm-hmm.
But with flux, it's opposed to what is diametrically opposite to it, right? So if you're looking at what is I'm looking at this particle, and I'm trying to understand time based on this particle. So it's that particle's movement in relation to the universe.
Mm-hmm.
Or I'm looking at the universe and I'm saying, how does this move in relation to this certain particle? Right? And that particle may even be what is like a moment.
Mm-hmm.
But then that's where it's confusing to me, because then that's what you were talking about with like what we perceive is the localized. It is the flow itself.
Yeah.
But that is not necessarily what is. What we perceive is not necessarily what is. Our perceptions can be deceiving in that way. So would we say that the moment then would be the moment would be the particle, or the moment would be the localized? At least in relation to time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I don't know. Go ahead.
I mean, I was going to say that, like, how do we see the hierarchy of this, right? If the timeline is always there, right, then if it's an all-encompassing thing, if it's always there, right, no matter the level of change, perpetual, no matter what, the micro or the macro level of change, if it's always going to be there, do we see it like as a base, like if you were building a house, like is it the foundation upon which every form of change, whether flow or flux, is built upon? Like, how do we see the hierarchy of time in all of this?
Yeah,
is timeline at the base of everything?
Well, I feel like, in a way, sure, yeah, right? I mean, thinking about ideas of prime mover, thinking about ideas of genesis of the universe.
Okay.
But the kind of image that's coming to my mind is the Ptolemaic system, right?
Mm-hmm.
You have the motion of the heavenly spheres,
Mm-hmm.
and then you have like the sun, basically,
Mm-hmm.
and then you have like the earth, which for me, even if in the Ptolemaic system the heavenly bodies move, their movement's the least perceptible.
Mm-hmm.
It's like 1/100th degree every 100 years or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
That seems to me that has to be the basis, right? In order to get a particular motion, you have to have.
It's the reference point. How else, without using the timeline, how else can you reference an event in which change occurred?
Yeah.
Without saying on this day or every few hundred years, how can you say how much it changes?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, without, I guess, a unit of measurement.
And that's what, right, the Julian system kind of did for time, was it
Right.
made it more accurate by including the macro scale.
Mm-hmm.
But and so you could build a foundation or a hierarchy that doesn't include that, but how accurate is that system going to be if you're not including the macro, which should kind of, the implications of the macro should be that it is the prime, right? It's before the micro.
Right. But what does that really mean? The macro is before the micro. Did major changes happen before the small changes happen?
Yeah. Almost again, this idea of the localized, like on a universal scale, you have to have a universe. And the universe leads to a micro scale. Then you have the particulars. And then you have something, an observer, an object, that begins to observe that interaction of those two things on a local scale.
Right.
So, I mean, it's a weird thing where, like, maybe as humans, we can't recognize the macro until we recognize the micro. But first, we have to recognize ourselves.
Wait, so can you repeat what you said about how humans can recognize the macro, but they can't? They have to recognize the macro first before they can recognize the micro. But I thought what we were saying about micro was that it's localized. And if it's localized, and for example with the river, if we're saying that the change happens in a localized state and the subject sees it first, doesn't that mean that the subject, in this case a human, sees the micro first, not the macro first?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying, for sure.
So you're saying the macro, you see the micro first before you see the macro.
But you don't see the micro, you see the localized, right?
Yeah, and that's what I'm saying.
Isn't that the same?
No. We're saying that there's a particular micro,
Right.
there's the localized, and then there's the macro.
Okay.
So like,
What is the localized?
Microscopy.
Mhm.
Yeah,
What is that?
microscopy. That wasn't around for, dozens of years, but that is still that would be the equivalent as far as what we're saying to the micro.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And this is where I was a little troubled by what you were saying, because then there's astronomy, which would be our equivalent of the universal.
The macro. Right.
Yeah, the macro, and then there's the
In between.
Ego.
well, yeah, the perceived world. I mean,
The
both
self,
of those are
right.
part of the perceived world, but it's through augmentation,
Sure.
right?
Mhm.
We have to have telescopes, we have to have microscopes, we have to have, huge mathematical reasonings to be able to even glimpse towards what the
The two
macro
extremes.
and what the micro are.
Well, to
Right.
glimpse beyond the seeming, right? Because we can see
Mhm.
the stars with our bare eyes.
Yeah.
And even if in antiquity, with less light pollution, they saw even more.
Yeah.
Right. But it's the ability to then transcend the macro, and begin to see the micro at work.
Mm-hmm.
And we needed to develop microscopy in order to, I don't know, that's how I pronounce it, I don't know. But
Took you less tries than me, so it's probably good.
like we could see the stars, but until we invented these things
Mm-hmm.
and we supplanted kind of our ideas
Mm-hmm.
onto our logic, then we began to see the inner workings of those things.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's like it is a weird reversal, right?
It's almost paradoxical because you're trying to examine a macro thing by going into its micro,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah. Yep.
Doesn't that make sense?
Yeah. Think about astronomy today, right? They take what is it called? I don't know, but anyway, they measure the light spectrum
Mhm.
that any given star gives off,
Right.
and then through analyzing that light spectrum, they're able to give you chemical composition of that star. They're able to give you rotation of that star. They're able to
Mhm.
give you
Mm-hmm.
what's around that star.
And that's how we get the images of the stars too.
Mm-hmm.
Like we don't have actual imagery of any of these distant stars.
Mm-hmm.
All of the images are compiled based off of
Data.
data.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Data that we abstract and then we reconceptualize.
Mm.
Okay, so again, going back to my question now, so there's the micro, there's the macro, and then there's the localized. And the subject, the ego, sees the localized version first.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Well, and maybe the word you used there, which is interesting, might, I don't know if it's going to shed any light on it, but the word abstract, right? This means like to take something away from, right? And I'm wondering, is that what we're doing in these, like when we're looking at the micro and the macro? Are we taking something away, or are we adding something? And because that's right, you know, in the question between flux and flow,
Yeah.
Right.
you know, which is that original question, is the flux an abstraction of what the flow is, or is the flow an abstraction of what the flux is? What is our localized version, what we perceive, more of an abstraction than what is actually happening? So like that data which is being compiled, is that maybe not more of a pure view, a less abstracted view of what the universe really is?
Like, is the light spectrum that a star gives off less abstract than the data is more pure than the data we
Well,
abstract
and
from?
the data that we compile is still more pure than what our perception is.
Oh, yeah.
So the flow
Sure,
is
sure,
the
yeah.
more abstracted
Right.
than what the flux is. When we're talking about observing change, we observe the change in the flow of a river, but that is an abstracted view of what is truly happening, which is either on the particular or on the universal scale.
Or on both. I mean, it's on both.
Yeah, it is on both at the
'cause-
same time.
And that's what we were kind of saying, right? The localized, or at least I was implying early on, is that the localized is an interweaving of both the micro and macro. And that it's weird. I mean, you get into some weird areas with that, because thinking on, are we adding anything, right, by abstracting it? Is it the same? Is it the same as the data that's there, those data sets, or are we adding something new by abstracting it? And then because it gets to a question of like, is all of life almost this predeterministic thing? Is it predetermined by the micro and the macro scales? And then it comes together and we abstract off of those and we give meaning and value to those things that we're abstracting? Or is the ability to abstract something inherently adding something that wasn't there before, wasn't present or apparent? So that abstraction not being clear until you add an observer, create a localize it. And in a way, it almost seems like experience itself is what we're talking about. You don't experience a micro or a macro until you experience a local.
I mean, I guess what Chris is saying, I'll let him say that for himself, but I guess what he's saying is like the abstraction is the thumbnail version of either the macro or the micro.
Right. Yeah, but that's what's interesting about what you're saying then, is because if there is a predeterministic factor to the universe, right? If there are these forces which are moving things defined by those forces, then from the inception of the universe, everything should have already been determined, right?
Right.
Because the forces were set, and then the motions happened based on those forces. So really, you know, it might be, you know, I'm sure it would be immensely complex, but the data
you could run it.
Yeah, the data is there. But that is interesting, because then what you're saying is that the abstraction, the abstraction is what we would define as free will.
Yeah, it's the novelty.
Right, it's the ego, it's the self, it's the perception view.
And that is something that can alter.
Right.
Can alter that predeterministic factor.
Yeah.
So like this may be what the predetermination is, but because of our separation from it, then we've now split off and have no idea where the hell we're going, as far as, I mean, what is supposed to happen.
I mean, it makes me think of, if you think of Aristotle's physics, right? Place was always something that kind of, I was like, what the fuck is place?
Right.
But it almost seems that is that I like this example of the thumbnail because on a computer screen
You don't have to see the full thing. You don't have to open it.
Well, not even that, but you create that shortcut, and that shortcut is attached to the micro and the macro, right? It's both what you're seeing and it's what's behind the scenes. But you can place that thumbnail wherever you want. You can place it in the start menu. You could place it on the fucking lower bar, whatever that's called. You
It
can
has
place
agility and
in-
mobility.
in a folder,
Right.
and so the placement is malleable. Where you place it, how you experience it, how it contributes to your understanding of your computer or whatever like that. But it itself is still always there. It's always predetermined. The shortcut doesn't determine where the actual data is,
Right.
or what the actual data is. It just is your relationship to that data. And so in a way, the ability to abstract, the ego, whatever we're talking about, this localized event, it changes the sequence of events. You can change the sequence of events based off of it, of observed events, right? Abstracted events. And that's what I'm meaning. Like, you can place it, it could be on your desktop menu, or it can be in your fucking scroll bar or whatever, you know? Like, how you place that, the shortcut, the thumbnail, how you abstract it, changes the way you begin to interact, and also like the time that you interact with things. And that's what I mean, that place seems malleable. Like, you begin to, by abstracting it, we can begin to, in a way, interpose our own timeline onto a predetermined state, or predetermined set of information.
I mean,
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, it sort of makes sense if we continue with this predetermination idea, but how did we base that it was predetermined? It's one supposition of many other suppositions.
Well, we're taking hierarchy, right? It was a hierarchy question.
Right.
Yeah. Well, and also a question of how things come into being, and then how they proceed from there. That if change is something which is determined by force or forces, then with that force or with those forces, then there should be some level of predetermination, right? You should be able to say, this was the initial force, these are the forces that are acting,
right?
And therefore the particulars, the particles, are going to act upon these universal forces, right?
Yeah.
So everything is predetermined in that everything is going to act based on those things.
Whatever the prime mover was.
Sure.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And you guys will get with like laws. If you think about laws, like eternal laws and natural laws. The eternal laws are things like time, space, stuff like that. The universal laws, physics, the physical laws, part of the eternal laws. But then the natural laws, which would be like weather systems, patterns, and all these things, are determined by the universal laws, but they're not exactly the same thing, right? Because they're almost in a way a localized event of the universal laws. And so just saying, like, why is there that hierarchy? What makes it predetermined? It's those natural laws. The environment is predetermined based upon the eternal laws.
Okay. I mean, so two things seem to me like, again, when we're talking about hierarchy of this, it's the timeline and it's the location. So timeline first, and then location on top. I don't know how we're putting this.
Well, I think time is probably the lower of the subset, right? Because there would be place, space, that would be the first.
Right.
And then there's or
I don't know.
I don't know.
Yeah,
Or
time and space simultaneous.
yeah, and that may be the because that may be the case, because space is also a relative thing. Yeah. Or place is.
Yeah.
I don't know if space is necessarily, because space is that which in place is inhabited, right? So if space being that which holds what is necessary for place and time to exist. So space being the vessel and the laws within that vessel.
Sure.
And then place and time coming into existence at the same moment, the first moment.
That's very Christian.
Sure it is. It's also very. What's the religion of science called?
Religion is evolution, I guess.
Maybe they aren't so separate. You know?
Yeah. For sure.
But yeah, so at that assuming that there is a moment of inception, and even if there isn't a moment of inception, still talking about it in the aspect of there being a hierarchy of some type.
Mm-hmm.
The hierarchy would be first that which contains, right?
The space.
Mm-hmm.
And then
the space, and then there would be place and time, but that would still be, because space is not only the container but also the forces within that,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
So even if all of these things are eternal,
Mm-hmm.
they have always been and they always will be, it's still that level of hierarchy.
Yeah.
Where you have
One succeeds
space,
the
which
other.
also contains force,
Mm-hmm.
and then you have time and place underneath that.
Mm-hmm. That's not the same as like a tripartite, though, right?
I mean, who said it has to be a tripartite?
Well, I was saying Christian. That's
Yeah, the Christians would.
Christian.
Right.
Christians would say that.
Well, what I'm saying is, if you have one thing that's existing as different things at the same time,
Mhm.
you have the vessel that's also existing as the laws within itself.
Mm-hmm.
It's duality, basically, is what we have.
Mhm.
So wait, the Christian notion is the 3 in 1 and 1 in 3,
Yeah.
the Trinity.
3 in 1.
Yeah. Well,
Isn't
that's
1 and 3?
debatable. I mean, that is the debate, right?
The debate is 3 in 1 and 1 in 3.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, between multiple different sects, that's
Is
been an
it?
ongoing.
Right. I
debate.
mean, it's like this, right? 3, 1, 2, 3, and then something in the middle. This is God, right? And then
Well, it's a question it's the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Is that 3 different beings in one being,
Oh.
right.
or is it one being in 3 different forms or aspects?
Is
I
that
would say the
different? Is
former.
that different?
It's different enough to cause a lot of war.
Sure. But I mean, it's almost just like the inverse equation
Sure.
in a way,
Sure.
which
Hmm.
is the same thing. It's just a different logical process.
But maybe if you're wanting that trifecta, that Trinity, that Holy Trinity, or
That-
the scientific equivalent to the Holy Trinity,
Yeah.
whatever that might be.
A holy triangle.
Yeah, that
Right.
holy triangle.
Equilateral triangle.
Right, because if you look at it like
Um,
this, how can each of these not be one another? Like, how can each of these...
It almost
right.
seems
It's-
again the question of micro versus macro.
Mm.
If you're looking on a macro scale, then it would be one being in 3 beings. If you're
Mhm.
looking on a micro scale, it would be 3 beings in 1 being.
Yeah.
Again, perspective, right?
Mhm.
Which direction are you headed in observing something?
Right, and that's what I'm wondering is with the universe. Then, if we're looking at that as an equivalent, then is it perhaps because we had the space, and then we had place and time, but then there's the thing that allows us to understand place and time, right? Which is the particular, the particular world. So the particles, that which makes up
The
the physical aspect of the universe,
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
that would then be your third aspect
Yeah.
to the divinity, which actually
So it is a compounding.
and it's interesting.
Compounded motion.
Yeah, it's interesting because they line up together as well, right?
Mhm.
Because you have God the Father, God the Son, he which came down to earth, and then God the Holy Spirit, that which kind of
Mm. Representation.
pervades throughout all being within the universe.
Mm-hmm.
So you'd have I know.
Yeah. It sounds voodoo a little bit.
No, it's a little out there. I get it. But I mean, there would be then some type of like equivalency that's happening on not just that there's 3 different aspects to the universal being, but there is also a lining up between what all of these different things are within the universal being.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, how does this logically work? Because obviously it's a paradox, right? How does, like, my question is, isn't paradox by definition something that doesn't follow logic? That it's something...
It appears to not follow logic.
It appears
It
not
appears,
to,
yeah.
right? It's
Mhm.
tricky. It tricks your brain.
Mm-hmm. It's illusory.
Right. But at the same time, it makes sense. Right? It makes sense. The paradox, that by definition, it makes sense.
If you think like parallax, or even like thinking of astronomy, when you see retrograde motion, right?
Right. Exactly.
Originally, they did think it was just a star
Right.
moving backwards in
Mhm.
space and then moving forwards again.
Right.
And so it made sense. Stars just move backwards.
But that's again a perception, right? It was not the data.
Yeah.
It was not the actual data,
Mhm.
which is the
There was-
objective thing.
Yeah, it hadn't been abstracted, I guess, is what we said, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, I wonder if it hadn't been abstracted or if it had been abstracted too
Poorly, right?
much. Well, in that, so it's too based, it's too centralized on what the perception is,
Mm-hmm.
and not towards what the data is.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right? If we were saying that the data is the purest form, the least
Yeah.
abstracted form, then
Mm-hmm.
this was too abstracted. It was
Yeah.
too based on just perception.
Yeah. So in a way, the number one issue with a geocentric idea of the universe, everything in relation to the Earth, let's bring it here and
Mhm.
say that this
The
is
ego, right?
yeah, this is the localized event. This is the most important place. Instead of saying, how do we try to get to where that motion is most clear
Mm-hmm.
beyond our senses? So I mean, it seems to come down to direction within space.
Direction within space. Can you?
Like the motion. So if we have a vessel, right, and then we have the laws, and this is space, place, time,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
and then you have the center of that, which we could say is the observer, the localized event.
Mm-hmm.
Depending on which direction you go from that localized event,
Mm-hmm.
that's going to determine kind of how you perceive things. Almost if you think again of like Ptolemy's system, right? When he's describing the there's like that place where the stars are going up straight up and down.
Where is that place?
It's about direction.
Right.
Were you the one? Somebody recently clarified it to me, but
Oh, the three types of what is it called? It's in the very beginning of
Yeah,
Ptolemy.
mhm.
It's
It's
an
describing
introduction.
system.
It's the
Mm-hmm.
what is that called?
His introduction.
What?
What's his
well,
introduction
no,
called, or was
it's part of the foundation of the Ptolemaic system.
Yeah,
It's in that
like the
in that
stars go
section.
like this, or the stars go like that.
Yeah, 45 degrees,
Right.
90 degrees. and then
Oh,
45
the
degrees
what are they
in
Are you
the
talking about
direction.
the equinox? And
Ye-
the
No,
or are
well,
you talking about the positioning
the-
within
the positioning.
So when it's at zenith or when it's at the
Ye-
horizon?
yes, exactly.
Yeah.
That's what you're talking
In a
about.
way, yeah,
Yeah.
something like that. But anyway, someone clarified it to me recently, and it's just what direction you're standing in. It has
Yeah.
no relation to where you're at on Earth. It's just what direction are you facing,
Mm-hmm.
and then the motion of the stars will be different depending on what direction you're facing. Are
Right.
they going directly?
Above you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Or are
I
they
see what
going
you're
at
saying.
an angle,
Right.
perpendicular?
Mm-hmm.
And so it's like, that to me, that's what direction kind of is. It determines how things look to you.
Right.
And so depending on which direction you're going from the localized event, things will look different.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know where I was going with that, but...
Well, I mean, and maybe this is the localized event versus the attempt at looking at the universal, right? Because that's what Ptolemy does, is he gives what seems to be a somewhat arbitrary north, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
He says this point does not move,
Mm-hmm.
and everything seems to rotate around this point.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, that is north.
Mm-hmm. Celestial north, yeah.
That is our celestial north, and everything moves. The entirety of the cosmos moves in that direction around that part.
Yeah. But it seems to me the localized event in Ptolemy's system is more of the sun than it is the Earth.
How?
Like the sun is how we get diurnal motion. The sun's motion is diurnal motion.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
It's that
daily.
it's that day-to-day experience.
Mm-hmm.
The localized, and that being the localized event, and the micro scale being Earth's experience of that localized event.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it facilitates, it provides opportunity for the localized event to be there, to happen.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know how sun is the only thing that's localized. Sun is the
Sure.
how is it the localized?
Sure.
I mean, doesn't the universe as a whole provide the opportunity for the
Well, the third dimension, right?
what do you mean by that?
Like the physical reality
Yeah.
is a localized event.
Right.
So our perception of everything, no matter how far we go out into the universe,
Will be localized
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
in relation to the subject.
Yeah.
Right.
But it doesn't change those laws that gave the attributes of those events, this physical place
Right.
or perceptible place. It's pretty fucked up. No, I mean, yeah. Go ahead.
No.
Somebody.
I had nothing.
I don't know. I mean, so, and kind of bring it back around to this flux and flow. Then,
Uh-huh.
so it seems like it's less of a trichotomy, right?
Mhm.
The particular, the universal, and the localized. It seems like the localized is very much the spectrum that exists between the universal and the particular.
Wait, say that again.
That the localized
Yeah.
is the spectrum between the particular and the universal,
Sure.
rather than a specific place.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, at any
Yeah,
given
sure.
moment,
Mhm.
for a certain perception,
Mhm.
it is
It's always
localized.
place. Yeah.
yeah. But there's a spectrum on which that specific moment for that specific perception of that individual happens.
Mhm.
Somewhere on that spectrum between the particular and the universal.
Yeah.
Man, I should get some more of that CBD. Makes you feel great.
Yeah, I mean it's almost my mind keeps going because it is universal, right?
Mm-hmm.
We have this idea of
A loop.
a torus.
Mm.
And so we can say that this is the local, right? This place in between.
Mhm.
If we think there's a black hole, white hole at two ends of the universe, it's just a theory.
You gotta explain what those two things are, man.
But the event horizon,
Mm-hmm.
that infinite space
Yeah.
in between the black hole and the white hole being the localized event, this is where experience is happening. And then we have a micro and a macro kind of responding outside of those bounds.
Interesting.
Is that kind of something like...
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I
So
don't.
this being
Yeah.
being the spectrum between, if we say the black hole where things go in is
Mhm.
a micro scale where
Mhm.
everything comes together.
Okay, what do you mean things go in?
This is a
And does it get out of there? The white
Yeah,
hole?
at the white hole. So the
And
white
where does
hole,
it go?
it goes back around to the black hole.
yeah.
That's the theory.
Yeah.
Okay, what does? How does the mechanics of this even work? What
Well,
is
I don't
keeping that thing
think,
that?
it's not as much a mechanical system. I think what he's doing is he's giving a mechanical representation of a theoretical system,
Sure.
right?
Right.
So there, we have general concepts of what a black hole and a white hole are, right? And how possibly a singularity operates. So I think and correct me if I'm wrong.
Mm-hmm.
What he's trying to do is he's trying to give a somewhat mechanical system that seems semi-universal in that it is based on cosmic events,
Right.
singularities that exist or appear to exist within our universe, and say, here's a representation of it.
Right.
It's definitely not how I would have thought. That's fucking genius. Definitely not how I would have thought to represent it. But I think
It works.
I think it does. It does somewhat work. Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, the word that you used is singularity. So, I mean, I Googled singularity once, and it said that.
Well, you can always trust Google.
The Wikipedia excerpt was that it's
Wikipedia, even better than Google.
Edited by Solomon Cordo.
only 3 days ago. But it said that it's the point in which, for example, if you say technological singularity, it's the point in which things become one.
Yep.
That it's such a level of advancements that
True AI.
right, that
Singularity.
right, things become
Or
one.
technological singularity. Yeah.
Right, but how does this general singularity work? What do you mean by singularity in this case?
In this case, it would be that place where all things are being experienced. So the localized spectrum
Yeah.
is singularity, where you can travel to the ends of the universe, but it's all going to be localized to your experience and your perspective. So you will be experiencing the entire universe,
Right,
but all according to
to you.
an observation.
Mhm.
Isn't that always
Or
the
an
case
experience.
without a singularity?
But that's what we're saying. It's singularity.
Yeah,
It is.
It's,
It is,
This
yeah.
is that's what I was saying. This is a good physical representation of a philosophical idea,
Right.
because this is something that represents it well. That the idea of a singularity is a good representation of how a moment exists.
Okay.
At least theoretically, it's at the edge of a singularity within the universe. If one were to take a ship there,
Right.
the theoretical idea is that moment would be perceptively infinite.
Right.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah.
So to use something like a singularity to describe a moment seems appropriate, and
Right.
especially to describe a spectrum between two types of perception, the macro and the micro.
Right. Right. I mean, it makes sense. What I'm saying is, then why do people say we're going to reach singularity? Why don't they say we are in a singularity?
Well, I mean, again, they're talking about, most people are talking about technological singularity, right? And
Not the just base existence.
Well, and also I think the idea is to reach towards the next moment, right? Just because we are in a moment, just because we are in a singularity, does not mean that we don't want to reach that next moment,
And
the next singularity.
And it does. I mean, it does push on these ideas of God and things like that. Some of the ancients that really first started trying to develop a logical idea behind prime mover and again God and all these things is they come up with a phrase. I think it's Plotinus, but he comes up with a phrase that is that which nothing greater can be thought of. And so it's that place that all of our thoughts are coming. Again, it has a predeterministic idea behind it, but it goes to we started off with this whole Ponta Re, everything flows, or all things flow, but we have everything, right? And then we have flow. But if we're thinking of again direction, what the opposite or the negation of everything is nothing, right? And then the negation of flow would be just
Stagnant.
Yeah.
Stasis.
Yeah. Stasis, for sure. Right. And so if this, to me, would be nothing, and this would be stasis, right? But this is where everything is happening, everything is flowing, and everything is happening. And so that whole idea of this is singularity, but this thing of nothing that doesn't appear to move and appears to be static or in a state of stasis is still coming into singularity.
Yeah.
So more information is still coming. That thing that which was nothing before, now is.
Mm-hmm.
And so that, like, for me, that seems to be kind of what you're saying, is that we want another state of singularity where more is. We have everything, but what about that nothing? That thing that wasn't a being before. Everything is a being right now, but is there non-being? Are there things beyond being? And if so, if we're to know it, they have to come into being for a singularity to exist that encompasses and incorporates those things. And so that being a state of growth, that being the state of flux, that being the trigger to change, right? We have the spectrum within,
Mm-hmm.
but there's these things coming in and out of it that are feeding it over and over and over.
So with the what is flowing and what is stagnant, my question would be, is that based on perception?
I thought we said that it always is, always will be.
Well, no, but I mean,
The things outside of it?
Right. So the things outside of perception, are they remaining stagnant, or are they still changing?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But just outside of one's perception. Like,
I think we
is
can
there
assume that.
is there a changing reality outside of one's existence, or does something only change as soon as it is perceived?
Yeah, I mean, it goes to a question of, like, are there other dimensions, multiple dimensions, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it is, because if
Yeah.
How so?
meaning that perception is something that is only relatable to the third dimension in a way, if we can say that.
Mhm.
Just for the sake of the argument,
Mhm.
not saying that's
Sure.
entirely
No,
true.
no, that's fine.
But if the third dimension is the place where things are experienced,
Mhm.
perceived, and if there's an implication that there are other dimensions, then there are different sets of data. There are different data sets that
Mhm.
aren't perceivable in the third dimension.
Mm-hmm.
So that, for me, it would say that maybe those things are in their own kinds of flux, change, growth, but it's not perceivable until we transcend, our perception transcends this dimension.
Right. Well, no, I guess what I'm asking, and this is maybe backpedaling a bit, but maybe questioning some assumptions we might have made, is
Quite a bit.
is, you know, so we had originally talked about the flow, that localized experience being the abstracted version
Mm-hmm.
of what is existent outside of ourselves, right?
Yeah.
On the macro and the micro. So what I'm wondering is it possible that that's not correct? Essentially, the localized, like, perhaps there's existence outside of the localized,
Mm-hmm.
but that the localized is all that truly exists at any given moment. So what is perceived is all that ever exists at any given moment. And
Right.
it goes, and it's a question of going in and out of existence from there. So
Yeah, but a truer sense would have to incorporate those things that aren't.
what do you mean?
What-
Those things are.
Like, the truth is, and I thought that's what you're saying about the localized, is
Mhm.
that it's an abstraction, so it's less true.
Mm-hmm.
Well, no, it's a thumbnail of the true thing, of the
Right.
data.
Which would be less of what the
Right.
actual thing is.
Mhm.
Yeah. So it is less.
Low
less true.
resolution.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
No, that is what I was saying. I'm asking, is it that are we wrong to make that assumption?
How could we be wrong? I mean, okay.
Quite easily.
Right.
Well, what, in what way?
Right.
Yeah,
Would we be
that's
wrong?
more what I'm getting at. Is let's
How could we
let's
be wrong?
let's backpedal just a touch, and I just want to question some of the assumptions there
Right.
that were made.
Okay, so if the subject, right, the localized abstraction
It might be.
is, how could it not be? I mean, everything is in relation to the subject.
But we did say this, right? We did say that, or we did raise the potential for this,
Mm-hmm.
which is that the localized abstraction is a new thing. is novel in comparison to the strict data sets that we're pulling from. And if that is the case, even if it doesn't, you don't get the entire, in the thumbnail, you don't get the entire code of whatever the shortcut is to, or whatever the thumbnail is of. You have something that neither of those, the data doesn't contain, which is the thumbnail itself. And so it's representing the data in a new way, which could possibly mean that it is more true, right? That is incorporating those things, and in abstracting that data, you're able to see how those things come together. Whereas opposite of that, if you're just looking at a micro or a macro scale that has no localized event, so you can't compound the two of them, you're not going to get any relatability between the two, which is less true because they are correlated. So in a way, I mean, with that in mind, maybe the localized event is more true.
I would say it's the only true you can ever get. It's the only, you can only experience macro or micro at the localized level.
Maybe. I mean, there's ideas of like psychonauts, right?
I mean, you're introducing a new thing. So, what is that?
Well, no, it's the idea of some. I mean that.
Transcendental psychology.
But yeah. The kind of you can essentially go out of yourself, and see something on a more universal level than what a normal person can perceive.
Yeah, you can experience a greater reality by becoming a non-observer.
Right, but you transcend everything
transcend
from
observation. Yeah,
localized.
Yeah, but it still assumes that there is something outside of the localized, right?
And it also assumes that you come back to the local and you're able to bring those
experiences to it.
Could it not be still localized but from a different angle? This psychonautic whatever thing, right? Could this still not be localized but from a different, more zoomed out?
I think that's kind of
viewpoint.
what we just said, is you still have to come back to the local event.
Yeah.
You still have to come back to yourself.
You just take these experiences back with you.
But you can experience, so you can experience things outside of the local event, but they still have to be grounded in a localized event.
It's similar to the common like perception of it is like astral projection, right?
What is that?
It's getting in some trippy shit here. Maybe I will take one of those mushroom caps.
Today has been brought to you by psychedelic experiences.
You gotta get on that DMT.
Thanks, Joe Rogan. You changed my life. No, but essentially, it's the ability, the supposed ability to project one's essence outside of one's body.
Okay.
While one sleeps. So it's usually it starts with the idea of like lucid dreaming.
Right.
Where you're just being able to control your dreams, and then it's one step beyond that, which is that the soul, like and not necessarily like the immortal soul or the suke, right? The conscious mind.
Right.
You're able to exhibit that thing outside of your body, push it out of your body, and see things on a more universal basis while you're asleep. Yeah.
Right.
And then...
So metaphysical.
And then return back to your physical body and remember this.
Right. So body serving as a vessel, and you're just simply... the thing, whatever inside that vessel is getting out of that vessel and just wanders around with some form of agency.
Yeah. Again, the localized event transcending itself.
Yeah.
The consciousness being the localized event, the suke of the body.
Right.
The body being a vessel. Yeah, it's weird.
That was a trip.
And so, what did we learn about flow and flux?
They may and or may not be different.
Did we end it there? I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
All right.
All right. Episode 1.
Episode 1. Thanks for joining.
Brought to you by Psychedelia.